Here is a shimmering yellow ink by Pelikan Edelstein Golden Beryl.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
I wouldn't call this a bad ink entirely, but I will say it demonstrates why many people stay away from both yellow and shimmering inks. Generally, the tone is light, too light to stand out on its own on the page, but it can darken enough to actually be used. It does shade, but being a light yellow makes the shading the easiest part to read. As a shimmer ink, the shimmer is largely useless. A hard to see ink that can be harder to see at certain angles doesn't really appeal to me. This is Pelikan being late to the party getting shimmering inks and doing a really poor job of it.
The pen for today is a Pelikan P200. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a very light tone that's much easier to see on camera than it is in person. Now, we get no feathering and we get no shade, but you can chase down some of the shading looking at chased them, the first two words, where the C, H, S, E, and part of the D all have some shading in it, which is why it's easier to see. And the them, the part of the T, part of the H, and part of the E are readable. The rest of it just becomes very light and kind of unappealing. The wet fine nib is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine nib, making it easier to read on the majority. There's no feathering and there is no spread. The shading causes just a little bit of an uproar on this as we look at uproar. Starting darker, working its way lighter through most of the middle, getting just a little bit darker at the AR at the end. And there is some shimmer that occurs in there, and when you tilt the page just a little bit, then some of those darker spots become a bit reflective. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, and the thicker line really does make it quite a bit easier to read. We get no feathering and we get no spread, but the shading is at its pinnacle here. Looking at the word pinnacle, where the P is a nice darker tone, the I and first N go as a mid-tone. Second N gets darker, AC lighter again, and LE much darker. A lot of tone shift within one word, which is very nice. Again, we're dealing with where the shimmer is just not done especially well for this, in my opinion, the matching of it, because some of those darker areas have more shimmer in them, and when it turns a bit, depending on how the light hits the paper, it can then become a little bit harder to read. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is shading causing just a little bit of mischief. Looking at the word mischief, where you see it starts light in the M, goes to a mid-tone at the end of the M into the I, lightens up into the S, darkens into the chief at the end. And again, the shimmer is showing up there pretty immediately. When you look at immediately on the third line, you see you mostly get a very light tone, kind of hard to read, and add the hard to read with some shimmer that's happening, and it gets a little bit harder to read. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting to no surprise.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 11 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, and thankfully for that, with no feathering, with no spread. When you look at the shading, you can follow a little bit of what's going on. Looking at the word follow, though, you see it starts darker and it starts working its way lighter until you get to the second L. It gets darker again and then much lighter. And it's these lighter tones that still, to me, are not the best to actually read on the page. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a lot darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Probably the best readable tone on this paper. It has no feathering, it has no spread. It does have tiny spots of shading. Look at tiny spot on the third line. You see the T and the Y are a bit darker than the middle, which is a nice readable mid-tone. And spot is mostly lighter, still readable, but the bottom of the P and the T are both a bit darker, giving it some nice shading. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine nib. Very close to the tone that we got on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. Shading is kind of a small thing. When you look at small things on the second line, you see that in small, the tone variation that goes really is very minor. The A is only slightly lighter. The top of the first L, slightly lighter. Things between the T and the H, slightly lighter, and that little bit darker is barely noticeable. Looking at the broad nib, it is quite a bit lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We get spots of shading that are showing up, and I think the nicest spot for shading is on the first line, where you see the top of the T is much lighter than the bottom of the T and into the H. Even the H shows some lighter tones. Now, the shimmer that goes on here, when you see it, does make it quite a bit blah on the page. I really don't feel like the shimmer is doing much to really help this ink. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. I was hoping that this paper would alter the tone of the ink enough to really make it much more usable, and here it doesn't seem like it's going to be doing it. There's no feathering and there is no spread. There is shading going on, and unblinkedly, looking at unblinkedly, first word, you see the shading that's going on there is much, much better than it was on the Clairfontaine. Starting much darker at the un. The blink has mostly very light tones, and king at the end, the KI and most of the NG are a nice darker tone, but when it gets lighter, it gets hard to read. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine nib. Darker than on the Clairfontaine, much easier to read here. Really looking pretty good. I don't mind that it's mostly coming across as an orange, so it's shaded towards orange, so I don't feel like it's so much the paper altering the ink. We get no feathering and we get no spread. The shading is causing a little bit of commotion on the page. Looking at commotion, the C and the beginning of the O are a little bit darker than the M's O, but the TI get much darker and it lightens up again at the on at the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. There is some faint shading going on. Looking at faint on the second line, starts light, works its way darker to become very dark at the cross of the T. There's a glint of the shimmer, that's the word, coming through. Looking at the word glint, I do see quite a bit of the shimmer in the darker letter of T, where most of the word is very light, and I'm not really seeing much of the shimmer there. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get almost nothing for shading. There is little bits and little wicked moments. Looking at wicked, the K and the D are quite a bit darker than the rest of the word, which is good because you really can't see most of the rest of the word. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting to no surprise.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, I think this is a little bit darker in general than we had on the Clairfontaine. The vertical lines really distract from all of the writing, meaning this is a horrible ink to use on quad rule paper because it kind of melts into the background, disappearing some. Now, we get no feathering and we get no spread, and the shading we get is minor. This ink is a Cruel release done by Pelikan. Looking at Cruel on the third line, you see it's mostly a lighter tone and mostly hard to read. It is part of the E is a mid-tone and the bottom of the L is dark, or you wouldn't know maybe that there's some writing there. This is terrible. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, tiny bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with shading, not the kind of shading you should be proud of, the kind of shading you should look at in proud on the second line, where the P is a midtone, the R gets a little bit darker, the rest of the word gets lighter, almost fading out of existence. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine nib. We get no feathering, we get no spread. The shading happens very seldomly. Looking at seldom on the third line, the S is very light, except at the bottom into the E, which goes to a midtone. Now, it stays as a midtone most of the way, and I just need this to actually give more tone variation. It needs to get darker in order to be really usable. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get a light peppering of shading that only really happens, at times when you double over on something, like the cross of the T into the H on them on the first line. The shimmering itself leaves you shrieking, like shrieking on the second line. Very light word, almost no shading in it. There is some shimmer showing up, which makes this very light tone even harder to see. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Krishna Yellow Valley. Here is Noodler's Golden Brown. Here is Pilot 100th Anniversary Yellow. Here is Sailor Kobe number 21. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, if you could believe that. There's no feathering, there's no spread. I do fear that there is some shading. You see feared on the second line. The F and the D have a little bit of darker areas to it. Those darker areas, again, they let you know that some word is there. Very hard to read. If you were using this in your lab notebook in school, I can certainly see you being corrected over using it, because using this ink here is almost like losing what you wrote. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, thankfully, with no feathering, with no spread, with curiously better shading. Looking at curiously, second line starts darker, works its way to a nice midtone, very light at the OS, darkening up again at the TY. And a lot of problem that we're having here, it happens many times, is look at many on the third line. Very light as a word until you get to the Y, which is much darker. And looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine nib. It has no feathering, it has no spread, it has some shading coming in rather slowly, looking it slowly on the first line. Starts as a lighter midtone, a very light tone at the OW, darkens just a little bit at the LY, and what we're seeing there is the problem going on with most of this writing on the page. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. The shading that shows up is absolutely dreadful. Looking at dreadful on the second line, the D is slightly darker. The rest of the word is very light, except for the one part of the second D that shows the darkest tone that you can get. Shimmer is non-existent on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, there's no surprise that there's no ghosting, no bleeding. Don't use this ink on this paper.
While it's nice to see inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements this color on the page. Here is a blue ink by Diatramentis Document Dark Blue. Here is a red ink by Cross Red. Here is a blue-black ink by Noodler's Midnight Blue. Here is a brown ink by Califolio Caramel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. There is feathering, there is spread. I think the feathering and the spread actually aid you in being able to see this ink. There's shading that shows up in several places, like several places on the second line. You see a lot of nicer mid-tones, very light at the A of several, which is a problem, just like the top of the L there, which almost makes it disappear. Places starting as a darker, working its way much lighter till you get to the C where it starts to darken up again and become readable. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get feathering and we get spread, and again, both of those help this be able to see a little bit better. The little yellowing that's going on with this from this yellow ink, looking at little and yellowing, first and second line directly above and below each other, they are probably the easiest two words to read in all of this, with the exception of when the pen sat for a little bit before I used it. It's bad. Bad. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. There is also much lighter than on the Clairfontaine. There is feathering, there is spread. Because the ink is so light, I don't think that the feathering or the spread is any kind of an issue. There is some shading going on, and they really kind of put this ink out, I think, just wanting something. Look at they on the second line. Starts very light on the T, darker at the H only when the T crosses it, and the rest of the word is very light. Makes it very hard to understand the language we're reading on the page, looking at language on the third line. I can see it and I can read it, but a whole page of this, I might poke you in the eye. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering, we do get spread. Neither of those are a big deal. The big deal is the color we're getting here. As far as shading, we're getting none. And as far as the shining of shimmer, looking at shining, first line, no shading, no shimmer, no nothing. This paper's a sponge. Looking at the back of the page. Now, the most noticeable thing here is the medium and the wet fine. Both the ink got very deep into the paper. Nothing came through touching the page underneath. I guess you could, because this ink is so largely unusable, use it on both sides if you really wanted to.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The dry soft fine was almost unreadable, and the wet fine was just a bit darker, just a little. The medium with its thicker lines was much easier to read than the wet fine and showed off some shading. The broad made it look like all shimmer all the time. It really, through a lot of the writing, I was getting a ton of the shimmer that was coming through, except those papers that truly just absorbed it away. And, you know, so if you really want the shimmer, go for the broad. But for me, I like the nicer mixture that I got in tone, shading, and shimmer from the medium flow, medium nib.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.